Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we appreciate the past centuries of stewardship that have preserved these beautiful areas for our enjoyment today, and acknowledge the need to work with them to safeguard these lands and all their inhabitants for future generations to appreciate. Now, other news and events. These are just things that are going on in the next months or so. The ongoing course, probably everyone is aware that the Wonders of the Sailor Sea online course has already had their first session, but there are 3 more sessions. It lasts, I believe, until May 3rd. It's on Mondays from 7 to 9. So it wouldn't be too late if anybody's still interested in joining that. Now, next Thursday, the conservation section of Nature Vancouver will be holding, that's April 22nd. We'll be sponsoring a talk that's called The Waters That Bind Us, Stories of Expeditions, Education, and Earthly Enjoyment. And in short, this is about an expedition sea kayaker, Alex Martin, who in 2018 did a solo circumnavigation of Lake Winnipeg, over 1,760 kilometers in total. So that should be an interesting presentation. Alex Martin is an urban forestry student at UBC and is one of the 2020 bursary recipients. The following Thursday on April 29th, there is another conservation presentation. These are all at 7:30, by the way, same as all the ones. This is on Taylor's checker spot butterfly and conservation breeding program. This will be presented by Michelle Polly, who's a technologist for the captive breeding program of this particular species of butterfly. And it's a pretty exciting thing that they have established a restored habitat, which apparently is quite groundbreaking in the world of insect conservation. So that again is on April 29th, 7:30 to 9. On May 13th, the marine biology section will present predation of juvenile salmon, not the usual suspect. And the presenter is Zachary Shirker, so that should be pretty interesting. He is from he's a PhD candidate in the Pacific Salmon Ecology and Conservation Lab at UBC. And he works in the Cowichan estuary on the predation of juvenile salmon. On May 20th, the botany section will be having a presentation called Pollination Beyond the Birds and the Bees. And the presenter is Tia Papalainen from the Spencer Entomological Collection at UBC. I'm now going to just give you a little intro to Andy McKinnon. So probably a number of you know him. And the talk tonight is Natural and Cultural History of Magic Mushrooms in BC. We're very pleased and honored to have Andy come and speak to us this evening. Andy lives in the Chosen, has a long, prestigious career as a professional forester and professional biologist in BC. Since December 2014, he's also served as a municipal councillor in the Chosen. And although he officially retired in 2015, he seems to be busier than ever, returning to his mycorrhizal roots. Andy diverged from a very legal family and did graduate studies in mycology at UBC in the 1980s. He then spent 30 years as a forest ecologist with the research branch of the BC Forest Service. He was responsible for ecosystem classification and mapping, and his research focused on old growth structure and composition, the effects of climate change, and BC's native plants, fungi, and lichens. He was involved in implementing ecosystem-based management in Haida Gwaii and the Great Bear Rainforest. He established the old growth monitoring sites that helped to save places like the Kitlope. He taught rainforest ecology field courses in Banfield and Tofino for UVic and on Haida Gwaii for UBC. He has also taught mushroom ID courses in Tofino for the Rainforest Education Society and in Victoria. His recent research interests include the ecology of BC's ectomycorrhizal fungal species. And he was the lead scientist for Environment Canada's 2017 ranking of BC's threatened and endangered fungal species. He is the past president of Vancouver Island Mycological Society, SVIMS. If you watch his short video, Plants of the Bog, you will see his wonderful teaching style as he lies in the bog and teaches us to feel the sticky false asphodel or smell the sweet bale and Labrador tea. And he is an enthusiastic participant, speaker, and field trip leader for various mushroom festivals in southwestern BC each autumn. He is known as a fun guy and is hugely generous mentor for young people setting up a BioBlitz. If there's a meal and gathering at the end of a naturalist camp, look for Andy with his guitar. He works as a naturalist and entertains guests on the Maple Leaf sailing tours. And he earned the nickname of Rock Star of the Botanist from Ancient Forest Alliance's Ken Wu. He is co-author of 6 best-selling books about plants of North America. Probably the one we all know, The Cojar Mckinnon, Plants of Coastal British Columbia, as it is colloquially known. But he's also co-authored Edible and Medicinal Plants of BC, Plants of the Rocky Mountains, Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast, Alpine Plants of BC, Alberta, and Northwest North America, Alpine Flowers of the Northwest, and Plants of the Western Forest. I believe he also has another publication coming out this September, which will be Mushrooms of BC. And I believe there's also another one to be released in 2022, Plants of Northern BC. So many of us will have a well-worn copy of some of these books. If one is going to get lost in the woods, Andy is your best foraging bet. Andy's an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University. In 2013, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of science degree from Simon Fraser. But tonight, he's going to enlighten us with the natural and cultural history of magic mushrooms in BC. Thanks so much, Andy.
Thank you, Carolyn. That introduction was just slightly longer than my talk is going to be tonight. I'm very pleased and honored to be invited to join you this evening. I will move to sharing a screen right away if we can here. Let me see. Let's see if we can make this work for us here. How about that? How does that look for people?
Looks great.
Can you see that? That's the beautiful poster that you made for me for this talk. I think the presentation tonight, depending on how distracted I get, should take a little less than an hour. And it's kind of difficult to give a presentation and watch the chat function at the same time. So I'm afraid we might have to have questions and discussion at the end rather than as we go through. And I apologize for that, but that's unfortunately a bit of a drawback for our presentation format here. I did put on a special t-shirt for you tonight. I'm not sure if you can see that. The very trippy mushroom t-shirt. I just wanted to start with that one. I'm pleased to be invited here, especially to Botany Night. I've given a mushroom presentation to the Victoria Natural History Society Botany Night as well. And it's interesting to me that people who want to talk about mushrooms end up in a botany night, because of course the mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of fungi, and fungi are very closely related to animals and not at all related to plants. So it would make better phylogenetic sense for me to give a mushroom presentation at one of your birders nights, for example, but really you do get a better class of people at a botany night anyway, so I'm not going to worry about it. I've met a number of people here tonight. I've met a lot of you on botany field trips, Botany BC. and have spent a lot of my time writing about, teaching about, doing research about plants. However, I did, as Carolyn kindly mentioned, do my master's in mushrooms between 1979 and 1982 at UBC. So it's very good now to have more of my research, more of my teaching, and a lot more of my writing involved with fungi, to come back full circle to a group of organisms that inspired my passion in the first place. Tonight, I'm going to talk about a natural and cultural history of magic mushrooms in British Columbia. I'll give a brief overview of the sort of the what we know about mushrooms in British Columbia. Then I'll talk about some of the various species of magic mushrooms in British Columbia. The best place to find all of these native and introduced species in the entire province is in the Greater Vancouver area. So this is a talk that ought to be of particular interest to those in the Vancouver Natural History Society. And this is a talk that I prepared with my very good friend, Paul Kruger. Paul is with the Vancouver Mycological Society. I'm with the South Vancouver Island Mycological Society, and was actually involved in the foundation of the Vancouver Mycological Society, also back in the days when I was doing my master's at UBC. So Paul and I'm old enough to have had very good friends like Paul for more than 4 decades now, which is longer, I think, considerably longer than some of the people on the presentation tonight have been on this earth. So this is a presentation by Paul and me, and we take turns giving it, and it turns out differently every time. It was mentioned earlier that there is going to be a new mushroom guide coming out in British Columbia. The official release date is September the 3rd, and we should have copies by June or July, I think. And we'll be giving a presentation at the Vancouver Mycological Society about this new museum handbook. For me, this is really exciting. I grew up with museum handbooks, and so to have the opportunity to actually contribute one, my master's supervisor at UBC was Dr. Robert Bandoni. And if you have an older Mushrooms of British Columbia handbook from the Royal British Columbia Museum, the lead author on that is Robert Bandoni, who was my master's supervisor, the late, great Robert Bandoni. So it's especially meaningful for me to do a new version of a book that my master's supervisor was actually the lead author on. It's a big book. I seem incapable of writing small books, and I apologize for that. This one clocks in around, I think, at 504 pages. It's certainly much more comprehensive than anything we've done before. I've been complaining for, 15 years or more, I suppose, that we really need a good mushroom guide, a comprehensive mushroom guide for British Columbia. There are some guides to different areas and some smaller guides. There are a lot of other mushroom guides available, mainly from areas south of us, that include a number of species that don't occur in British Columbia, and that don't include a number of our more northerly species. So anyway, this will come out. I particularly like the back cover juxtaposition of the redhead with her bear's head fungus on the top left and the green mushroom on the bottom right. I like the color combination. And you can find that one on the museum website. Should be in all the bookstores early September, just in time for the mushroom season, whatever it looks like. There are pictures you shouldn't use on the cover. This was one good example of the sometimes phallic nature of fungi. One of the nice things about doing a mushroom guide is you get an opportunity to put in pictures of your granddaughter. That's Margaret Skye McKinnon, my granddaughter, and my daughter-in-law, Ashley. And so I abused my position of influence and stuck a photo of my granddaughter and daughter-in-law in the book. Okay, so this presentation is by me and Paul Kruger. If you want more information on magic mushrooms in British Columbia, Paul and I are going to eventually put this together as an article for Fungi Magazine. But there are several articles on the website of the Vancouver Mycological Society. The URL is shown there. And one of them is Magic Mushrooms in British Columbia, which includes more information on some of the topics I'll cover tonight for people who are interested in learning a bit more. So there's me on the left at Whistler Fungus Among Us a few years ago. I don't know anybody who doesn't look better with a nice Cortinarius tucked behind their ear. And Paul Kruger on the right for those who know Paul. Paul and I have been friends, as I mentioned, for a long time. I know a lot of people on the talk tonight. Probably not too many people have seen me with dark hair, but there I am on the left. And almost certainly fewer people have seen Paul Kruger without a bushy beard. So here we are in 1980 on our tour across British Columbia. We called it a Pilzkrieg, Pilz being the German for a mushroom, collecting and material for herbaria, and just to learn a little bit more about BC's fungi and to have some adventures. So BC is a very cool place. I don't have to tell anybody here that, I think. I gave this talk at the Telluride Mushroom Festival in Colorado last year, a variation on it. So I had to do a bit of a British Columbia introduction. And one of the coolest thing about British Columbia is that it's a very large area with very few people. So, for example, British Columbia is a little bit bigger than California, Oregon, and Washington all put together. And yet we only have about 5 million people in the province. And we have the two mycological societies, the Vancouver Mycological Society and the South Vancouver Island Mycological Society. Anyone who's interested in mushrooms, learning more about mushrooms, really should check out the mycological societies. Wonderful groups of people. And of course, the best way to get to know any group of organisms is to go out with like-minded individuals who know those organisms. It's nice to have a book nearby for reference. It's nice to be able to check out other sources of information, but nothing beats getting out in the field with people who know a group of organisms. And that's the mycological societies. Elsewhere in British Columbia, oftentimes the natural history societies will have a group of mushroom fanatics in them. So there are ways to get at this topic in other parts of the province. So British Columbia is very topographically diverse. And you can grow up on the West Coast here and see mountains all the time and not appreciate that probably 90% or more of North America has no mountains. They're on the West Coast. They're in the Appalachians, I suppose. And then there are things that are called mountains in other places across Canada that we might call kind of glorified hills. And yet with a series of northwest to southeast trending mountain ranges, you get this incredible topographical diversity, which leads to incredible climatic diversity with wet climates on the west or windward side of these mountain ranges with dry climates on the east or leeward sides of these mountain ranges with elevational gains from sea level to alpine. I mean, you get topographical diversity gives you an incredible climatic diversity and an incredible ecological diversity. So there's more types of ecosystems and more types of just about any group of species you can think of in British Columbia than anywhere else in Canada. And that includes mushrooms. We have, as I say, a variety of different ecosystems. This is the Biogeoclematics Zones in British Columbia. So with topographic diversity, you get climatic diversity, yielding ecological diversity. And if you've got a lot of different ecosystem types, you tend to have a lot of different species. So BC has records for more than 3,400 macrofungus species in the province. There's a really neat report online, Macrofungus Species of British Columbia, for those who are interested. That came out a few years ago and has only, I think, 3,100 species in it. But the number of mushroom species we know for the province grows every day. And of the 3,420 some odd species we've recorded so far, a relatively small number of them are what we might call magic mushrooms. They contain the compound psilocin, psilocybin, which is converted to psilocin inside the human body and has specific effects, psychedelic effects, leading this group of mushrooms to be called the magic mushrooms. Here's a nice photo of the Liberty caps, perhaps the most famous of BC's magic mushrooms, on the left there by Tyson Ehlers. In fact, we were debating a while ago whether BC ought to have a provincial mushroom. And there were a number of nominations for Liberty caps as our provincial mushroom. If you are traveling across Canada and you bump into anybody and they want and mention anything about mushrooms in British Columbia, this is probably the one that first comes to mind. So now I'm going to talk about some of these magic mushroom species in British Columbia. As I say, here's Cylosuby Cyanessens out of the Liberty caps, probably the most famous of ours. But let's start with Cylosuby Eruginosis. This is an introduced species. It originates around Astoria, Oregon, where it grows from driftwood among the beach grasses in the sand dunes near the mouth of the Columbia River. It's easily cultivated in outdoor chip beds, and it's introduced into BC's lower mainland, and it's a very potent species. Cylosuby Eruginosis is one of the more potent species in the entire genus. And one good clue to these magic mushrooms, there's a lot of clues to what mushrooms are edible and poisonous that are useless and potentially dangerous. But one clue that actually works with the Cylosuby species is that if they have a lot of the hallucinogenic compound psilocybin in them, they will bruise blue. And the bluer they bruise, the more hallucinogenic compound they have in them. Cylosuby Baeocystis, which is very common, or certainly around the lower mainland. It was kind of much more common around the more central Vancouver area in the 1980s on residential landscaping in Vancouver on conifer bark chip mulch. And it's still common today in the interfaces between sort of suburban development and forested or agricultural lands. It's just moved out as the footprint of Vancouver has moved out to that interface between urban and rural, if you will. This is also one that was very funny when I was on UBC campus. I was there from 79 to 82 doing my master's in mushrooms, and the The gardeners, obviously at UBC, were tired of all of the invasive vegetation that would come in and compete with the plants that they had put in their beds all over campus. And they thought, well, they could gain a great measure of control by simply applying truckloads and truckloads of conifer bark mulch to their gardens in between their plants, and that would keep the vegetation down, and their gardens would become much easier care. Somehow or other, and almost certainly with the assistance of UBC students, some of this bark mulch had Cylosopy Biocystis in it, and it spread rapidly throughout the UBC gardens, and the gardens just as rapidly became trampled by students gathering Cylosubi Biocystis. So what started out as rather an innovative approach to try to control competing vegetation turned into something that led to an awful lot of their gardens being trampled. Another very famous among aficionados, BC magic mushroom is wavy caps. And this is Cylosuby Cyanessens. It's common where, again, wood chips have been incorporated into mulches. With Cylosuby Cyanessens, it thrives on hardwood wood chips. And around southern Vancouver Island and the lower mainland, very, very common on alder bark mulch. It also can form stable populations, and there were some of these around UBC in kind of disused clearings grown in with alder trees and broom and Himalayan blackberry and things like that. Again, this is a very, very potent species. And again, you can see some of the bluing on it. This is one that grew in a friend's yard out near Souk, and he showed me some pictures of it. It was 100% cover over the ground of a very powerful mushroom. And then it got snowed on, and someone had trouble getting their pickup truck out of the area where all of these mushrooms were growing in alder mulch. And you could see two tire tracks that eventually made their way out of this snowy bit, and the area where the tire tracks were growing were heading out of this bit of snow were all stained blue. It was an extraordinary effect. So again, wavy caps, common and abundant, and throughout the lower mainland, southern Vancouver Island, and elsewhere in British Columbia. Here is one of the few of these Cylosuby species that I could say with some certainty is actually a native species. This is Cylosophy Cyanofibrilosa, and it's generally found in the tangled roots of shrubs and trees in flood zones of wild mountain rivers, though you can also find it in bark mulched areas in and around Vancouver. Here it is in its native habitat. And so you can imagine that being on the sandy banks of some river in a remote location. So this is certainly one of British Columbia's native species. Here's a European species, Cylosophy Femateria. It's occasionally found in grassy fields in the lower mainland. It's one of the few of the Cylosopy species that's got a ring on it, and so is sometimes confused with Cylosophy Stuntsia. Cylosophy Polliculosa. This again is one of our native species, and I think most people would agree that this is one of our LBMs, one of our little brown mushrooms, which is a group of mushrooms that are sometimes disparagingly called LBMs because they can be darned difficult to identify. This species here is usually found on conifer debris, in second growth forests, and it can potentially resemble species in some very poisonous genera like Galerina, and it has a very low potency anyway. So this isn't one that people gather for its magic effects, but is a charming little mushroom all the same. Again, the Liberty caps, Cylosubi semilanceata, they grow from dead grass roots. And they're especially common in wet pastures where the dead roots form a thick thatch. They oftentimes occur in grazed fields, but despite common wisdom, which in this case is not particularly true, they do not grow on dung. And that's one of the misconceptions of Liberty caps. They'll oftentimes grow in fields where there are dung, but they're not growing on the dung. Very, very pretty species. Here it is on Haida Gwaii. Here's Cylosophy Stuntsia. I mentioned earlier that the European Femateria could be confused with this species because it's got a ring. There aren't many of these Cylosophies that have rings on them. Here's Stuntsia again, which is a common weedy species of urban and suburban areas where the lawns and the mulches have woody materials in them. And again, this is one of those Cylosophy species that is a bit of a little brown mushroom or an LBM, fairly low potency and easy enough to confuse with species of Galerina, which can be very poisonous. And then there are a few other genera of mushrooms in British Columbia, which contain variable amounts of psilocybin, and Cylosopy cyanopus is one. It's a tiny, delicate lawn mushroom of wet summer and warm early autumn time. And some related Cylosophy species can be poisonous, and it's a difficult genus to work with. So I don't think too many people gather this one as a magic mushroom, not when there are all the other good ones out there. And then Gymnopolis Eruginosis, which may or may not be the same species as Gymnopolis luteifolius. It's a brightly colored bitter mushroom that grows on wood and has a beautiful spore print, contains hallucinogens. And this is one that Paul likes to mention, almost always disappears from the annual Vancouver Mycological Society mushroom show. It's on the table with its label, and then it's gone. Same thing happens to a lot of the Cylosophies. And here's one more mushroom that can contain smaller amounts of psilocybin, Panaeolus subvoltiatus, which grows in very richly manured soils, sometimes around stables and manured straw around stables. Okay, so that's a quick review of the natural history of some of the magic mushroom species in British Columbia. There is a long history of human use of magic mushrooms in Mesoamerica. Here is an Aztec Codex from the mid-16th century, the Maglia Beckiano, the Codex Maglia Beckiano. And you can see the individual eating the mushrooms. You can see the mushrooms, the individual eating the mushrooms, and being visited by a spirit on the right-hand side there. Similar imagery in the Codex Vindobonensis Mexicanus. This is 14th century Mixtec writing. Just a couple of examples that show pretty clearly that people were collecting, eating magic mushrooms, and using them to commune with other worlds. And this went on for centuries, of course, was not particularly welcomed by the early European explorers of Mesoamerica. But magic mushrooms in North America really became popular after a 1957 Life magazine article, Seeking the Magic Mushroom by R. Gordon Wasson, which described his experience taking psilocybin mushrooms in 1955 during a Mazatec ritual in Oaxaca, Mexico. And as far as Paul and I are aware, this was where the term magic mushroom was coined, was in the title of this Life magazine article in 1957. A point that Paul likes to emphasize is that in the 20th century, most people will know Timothy Leary as being instrumental in popularizing and spreading the use of hallucinogens, helping spark the psychedelic revolution. He is, I think, most closely associated with the substance LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. But he first tripped by eating mushrooms in Cuernavaca, Mexico in 1960. And it wasn't for a while after that until he moved on to LSD. Now, in the 1960s, following the Wasson article, there were a number of seekers who went to Mexico to try and experience the same sorts of things that Wasson experienced. But during the 1960s, some folks began to realize that these magic mushrooms were not confined to Mexico, but they could be found many other places in North America and elsewhere. So let's go to UBC in 1965. Don't know if anybody here was at UBC in 1965. Paul and I have had great difficulty trying to tease out the full story. There is some conflicting records, and probably for good reason, I think. But in 1965, some students at UBC collected and ate Liberty Cap mushrooms from the UBC endowment lands. This much we know. A 1967 reference says that the students ate them, quote, for psychotomimetic effects. That is, to induce an effect similar to psychosis. More likely, they were eating them simply for their hallucinogenic effects. The RCMP were eventually involved, and this is the first record that I know of, that we know of the recorded use of these mushrooms in North America, north of Mexico. That's on the UBC campus. So there's a very good British Columbia reference for history of magic mushrooms. Magic mushrooms were known to exist around UBC as early as 1964, at least. That's when UBC mycologist Dr. Robert Bandoni, you've heard the name before, my master's supervisor in late 70s and early 80s, and co-author of the earlier Royal BC Museum Handbook, Mushrooms of BC. Robert Bandoni sent some specimens to North America's most famous mushroom scientist at the time, Dr. Alexander Smith at the University of Michigan, who identified them as Liberty Caps, Cylosopy semilanceata, quote, without doubt. So Dr. Bandoni was aware of the presence of these magic mushrooms on UBC campus by 1964, at least, a year before the students were arrested for possession. So by the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the incursion of synthetic and hard drugs, along with a violent subculture and unreliable and toxic supplies, caused many people to seek out natural highs, causing much more interest in mushrooms. The discovery that they grew abundantly locally in nature increased the appeal and the profile, and they became well-known, popular, and widely used. And really, in Canada, nowhere nearly as much as in British Columbia. So by the early 1970s, many areas in British Columbia, including Haida Gwaii, had become well-known. Haida Gwaii, Cowichan and Comox Valleys, and Greater Vancouver area. Here we are in a field in Tsawwassen, not far from the ferry terminal. Had become well known for having productive Liberty Cap mushroom fields and were attracting large numbers of pickers from across Canada. So this is around the mid 1970s or so. In late 1974, psilocybin possession was prohibited when it was added to the list of restricted substances in Canada's Food and Drug Act. And here we can see the list of convictions following the prohibition of psilocybin, growing very quickly throughout the 1970s. And you can see in the early years that these people came from a number of different provinces. And by the time you get to 1978, 81% of the convictions were people in British Columbia. But it's worth noting that in the earlier 1970s and right through the 70s, an awful lot of the people who were arrested for possession of psilocybin containing mushrooms collected their mushrooms in British Columbia. So there were lots of people who traveled across the country, right from the Maritimes to British Columbia to pick magic mushrooms. So this takes us up to 1979. And so throughout the 70s, there were these influxes of people in British Columbia and lots of people born and raised in British Columbia who collected magic mushrooms, despite the fact that the possession of psilocybin was prohibited. You can see a bag of the dried magic mushrooms there. They made their way right across Canada. And this had an important effect on some aspects of culture in British Columbia. Here are a couple of examples. If you're familiar with the Georgia Strait, it used to be, still around, used to be a much more alternative sort of journal. And here are some Georgia Strait covers from 1974 and 1975 showing people out in the fields picking magic mushrooms. I like the fact that the one on the left from October 31st, 1974 is 25 cents, and that it is an entire mushroom issue of the Georgia Strait. Okay. So it was important in some aspects of culture, and especially on Vancouver Island and around the Lower Mainland, and also in Haida Gwaii. There were also lots of guides around to magic mushrooms, how to identify them, how to use them, and a few of them, like the one in the lower right there, Psilocybin, the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guidebook, guides to growing magic mushrooms. And I think that book is still in print as far as I know. There were also lots of conflicts, and the conflicts oftentimes didn't involve possession of the mushrooms or people acting poorly when they had eaten the mushrooms, but simply trespass and damage to farmers' fields. So people were picking magic mushrooms, especially liberty caps, in these very wet farmers' fields. Remember, the ideal liberty cap habitat was these very, very wet fields where it was so wet that the roots would rot in place, because this is what the fungus is feeding on. And these, of course, are the same sorts of fields, these very wet, seasonally wet fields, that could be most damaged by people and vehicles moving onto them. So there were all sorts of conflicts all over British Columbia. And then in late 1979, the BC Appeals Court ruled that possession of mushrooms in their natural state did not constitute possession of the restricted compound per se. And a Masset resident had been charged with possession of psilocybin after several containers of mushrooms were seized from her home, but she was acquitted, and a Crown appeal of this acquittal was dismissed by the appeals court. And what that meant was that from 1979 to 1982, the possession of magic mushrooms in Canada was not considered to be illegal. 1979 to 1982 also happened to be the years that I was doing my master's at UBC in mushrooms. So it was a very fun time. There are so many tales to tell of that time that it would have to be a different talk, I think, but I'll hint at a couple of them. And it was determined at the time that really there was only one lab in British Columbia at the time that could determine whether there was actually psilocybin in the mushrooms or not. And so because psilocybin was prohibited, but the mushrooms were not prohibited, unless you could prove that the mushrooms contain psilocybin, you couldn't prosecute people. And that was essentially the nature of the ruling. Here's Paul Marcano in a field near the Tsawwassen Ferry Terminal. Paul, with his brothers Ethan and Tony, founded the Fane of the Cylosuby Mushroom Association. Fane being a sanctuary. These three brothers, these three ambitious brothers, had earlier founded what I thought was the much cooler named organization, MAPLE, or Make All Psychedelics Legal Everywhere. When the Supreme Court ruled that the mushrooms themselves weren't illegal in 1979, the Fane was formed with the shrooms as the official sacrament, because the Marcano brothers knew that eventually they would be rendered illegal again, and that their best bet, if the magic mushrooms were the sacrament, was to establish it as a religious practice so that they would be protected by the Canadian Bill of Rights under the Freedom of Religion Clause. Ultimately failed, but I think an excellent strategy all the same. That's the Fane of the Cylosuby Mushroom Association. So the mushrooms from 1979 to 1982 were legal. Lots of people were collecting them. People were still traveling across Canada, as well as a lot of local collectors in British Columbia to collect these magic mushrooms. And there were complaints all over Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, and Haida Gwaii in particular, but in a few other parts of the province, Bella Coola Valley, for example, about trespassing and damage to farmers' fields. And so I want to see if I can, hang on just a sec here. This is a wonderful old film, but, whoops. Come on now. I need to make sure I can get the volume up to maximum level here because, okay. So let's go show from the current slide. And we'll maximize our volume here. Okay, so here is a 1980 CBC radio show, CBC television program on gathering magic mushrooms in British Columbia in 1980 during the period when they were when it was legal to do so.
People have come from across Canada to search the pasture lands of the west coast for this particular species of mushroom. Among drug users, it's popular now as an organic drug. In the dried state, it's selling for as much as $25 a gram. The species farmers say the pickers are spoiling their crops and endangering livestock. On Vancouver Island, Dieter Doverstein is organizing the petition demanding new legislation. He says he's taken to patrolling his farm by night with a shotgun since pickers threatened to burn his building. He's urging neighbors to follow his lead and arrest trespassers.
Well, we've been approached by 3 groups, and we've been offered $10,000 by each one just for the picking right.
What is it?
Well, I just don't want to be part of the drug scene. We'd like to have a possession of the wet mushroom, make it be illegal, and the police can pick those fellows up when they suspect them. They can pick them up any place. Now it's up to me to charge them for trespassing and for mischief. It's up to me to lay the charge. And I don't think that I'm a policeman. It's not my job.
The LCMP say they're swamped with complaints. They are worried about the possibility of violence, but say they just don't have the manpower to control the situation.
We all been practicing for a year on how to run, so I figure it should be no big deal because people travel 4,000 miles to come just pet mushrooms, man. They should be more friendlier because it's nobody's really hurting them because it's just grass you're walking on. You're not,
These 3 pickers ended up with a 5-day jail sentence for trespassing, with a warning from the judge in Courtney that the next group of offenders could expect even stiffer penalties. Colin Hope, CBC News, on Vancouver Island.
Okay. So as I mentioned, this period 1979 to 1982 coincided with the period when I was doing my master's in fungi at UBC in Hut B1 Annex, one of the old army huts now that used to be in the parking lot of the biology building. It's long since gone. And I was working with the ecology of an obscure group of microfungi that lived in streams. But we were, myself and the 2 other graduate students, were very interested in mushrooms of all sorts and learning to identify mushrooms. So we offered to identify mushrooms for anybody who brought them into the lab. And as I say, these 3 years that we did this happened to coincide with the years that it wasn't illegal to pick or possess magic mushrooms in British Columbia. So there were a lot of those that came through the lab. We also had a graduate student who was not in our group, who was very interested in looking at the biosynthesis of the hallucinogenic compounds in magic mushrooms. And I helped him grow vast amounts really of magic mushrooms in growth chambers in the UBC botany department so that we could look at the biosynthesis, so that he could look at the biosynthesis of the hallucinogenic compounds. And it was good fun. They were grown in mason jars. It was Cylosuby cubensis, the commonly grown sort of subtropical species. And the department was very nervous about it at the time, even though it was legal. And they agreed to letting us grow them in the growth chambers if the RCMP came by once a week check on them. And so we had dozens and dozens of jars, mason jars with magic mushrooms sprouting out the top of them. And each week, the RCMP, in my recollection, would come by and count the mushrooms that were growing in the various jars. And so long as the number was roughly the same as the week before, we were good. It was rather a funny time. It was rather a fuzzy time too. Let me see. There's me in the bottom right. Terry McIntosh in the bottom left. Arlie Krukeberg in the top left, for those who know Arlie or his dad, Art Krukeberg, or who knew his dad, Art Krukeberg, and the phycologist David Garbury in the upper right. So here's Cylosuby or Stropharia cubensis growing on inoculated rye seeds. This is what we were doing in the growth chamber at UBC. And this is one of my favorite, unfortunately, I think, apocryphal stories of the time, but it was told to me by a couple of different people about a friend of theirs who had eaten some magic mushrooms and then gone for a drive back to the North Shore where he lived, which is a very bad idea to operate any kind of a vehicle after you've eaten magic mushrooms. That one of the effects of the magic mushrooms, I have read, is that they will take colors, especially around the sunset, and spread them out in a very spectacular fashion. And this fellow in this story, which I've also heard from other places too, so I'm not that sure that it actually happened in Vancouver, but this fellow was driving across the Lionsgate Bridge to the North Shore, and he looked in his rearview mirror and saw police lights, and the sun was setting on the Lionsgate Bridge. You know, it was quite the scene, and the police lights, and he thought, oh my goodness, I am in trouble deep now. I must have been speeding, or he would not pull me over. It's a 50-kilometer-per-hour zone. He would let me go up to 60 without pulling people over, but I don't want to say I was going 70 or more, because then it would be excessive speeding. So the officer came up and he said, do you know how fast you were driving? And the fellow said, 65 kilometers an hour. And the officer said, no, you were driving 11 kilometers an hour. So anyway, not sure it actually happened that way, but it's a great tale all the time, and a good Vancouver tale, I think. So what about today now? Cultivated Cylosubi cubensis mushrooms are widely available in the kind of gray economy cannabis business, and the vast majority of magic mushrooms that are consumed today are cultivated. They're not wild grown. Much of the best of the Liberty Cap habitat is gone with development in agricultural areas and changes in farming practices also. If you can get better drained fields, you can get more productive pasture lands, but you also lose the ideal habitat for the Liberty Caps. And some of the very common weed Cylosubi species of urban areas have become scarce due to changes in landscaping materials and practices. In 1982, the Supreme Court ended the anomaly of these magic mushrooms being legal. So since 1982, right up to the present day, magic mushroom picking and possession is illegal, but rarely prosecuted. And certainly there is discussion in British Columbia as to whether possession of small amounts of various drug substances, including magic mushrooms — I don't like the term drug substances, but that's what they're talking about — be ruled not illegal once again. But it remains on the books as illegal, widely grown. It's not difficult to get magic mushrooms if you're looking for them. Here's Cylosuby cubensis, the most commonly grown mushroom species. Just as a couple of examples, here are some examples from a festival or a market in Vancouver. You can buy dried peyote mushrooms, but you can also buy hash and magic mushrooms in various different formats. This is happening at booths during the 420 festival and was unprosecuted. And here are some more photos from the July the 1st Cannabis Day markets in Vancouver. You can buy Nutella from those charming vendors on the left there. Not sure the Nutella people would approve of that. And you can buy magic mushrooms in chocolates, for example. As Paul likes to point out, we respond to some of the mushroom poisonings on Vancouver Island. Paul does the same in the Lower Mainland, and there are lots more people poisoned in the Lower Mainland from eating poorly prepared food preparations, perhaps like these magic chocolates of magic mushrooms, than are ever poisoned by gathering and eating wild poisonous mushrooms. And just as an example of how mainstream this has gone in British Columbia, you can buy your magic chocolates using Visa or American Express. This is not what I would call an underground economy. Now, one of the beneficial effects of people just relaxing a little bit about magic mushrooms is that there was experimentation and research done in before the 1960s into the use of some psychedelics, including psilocybin, the active ingredient in the magic mushrooms, in the treatment of various psychiatric ailments. So this is just from a 2021 article in Nature called Psychedelics Take Flight. This is a listing of the clinical trials testing psilocybin, MDMA or ecstasy, and LSD for use in psychiatric conditions, including depression, drug dependency, and anorexia nervosa. And you can see that there were a number of trials prior to the 1960s. They essentially largely shut down for about 40 years and are just starting to ramp up again. And the effect, there's an excellent book by Michael Pollan called Change Your Mind or something like that, that reviews a lot of this research that's showing great promise in treating things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety around death and dying, depression, a number of treatments that have proven remarkably resistant to all of the therapies and chemicals that people have thrown at them over the 20th and early 21st century. And they're achieving some remarkable and very promising results using ecstasy and psilocybin in trying to treat them in a way that some of the researchers, and certainly Michael Pollan in his book, suggests is due to these substances' ability to get people out of loops of thought that are characteristic of conditions like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, and basically take them out of their minds for a short period of time and allow them to recalibrate and reevaluate. Just to offer a few examples here, but it's a fascinating area of research and one that involves a number of researchers and trials around Vancouver. And a study published in November 2020, for example, 71% of the people who took psilocybin for major depressive disorder showed a greater than 50% reduction in symptoms after 4 weeks, and half of the participants entered remission. And some follow-up studies after therapy, although small, have shown lasting benefits. So this is a really fascinating and promising area of research for dealing with a number of disorders that have proven essentially resistant to a lot of other treatments, and all of a sudden they're showing not small improvements, but incredible for some of these researchers. If you read some of the literature, almost unbelievable results following these trials. So this is something that I think has been facilitated by the fact that we can start thinking about and we can start talking about substances like psilocybin and wonderful species like magic mushrooms once again.